Team, thanks for dropping in to the virtual town hall for our fortnightly political Geekfest, where we go through the findings of the latest Guardian Essential report with my partner, Catherine Murphy, who's in the soundproof booth, as they used to call it in the days of This Sporting Life, I remember.
Yeah, I'm definitely holed up in the scream pod.
Hey, before we get cracking, respects to traditional owners. I'm on Gadigal land. Join me in paying respects to elders past, present and emerging, recognising this land is not ours. The chat has started. Rudolph's already said hello. Everybody else jump in there and sort of let's get a bit of to and fro coming here, because we're dealing with some interesting issues this week. And I think, Catherine, it's been one of a very weird week where there was some really big global developments, and then there was this very, very personal crisis, and the two of those kind of intersected. And I think as we go through the polling, there's some really interesting, I think, collateral from what we've seen, because last week was set up really to be the launch of the virus, and obviously we were also in the middle of the showdown with Silicon Valley that our fearless leaders were driving with the support of not just Murdoch, but also the Guardian, which is an interesting little sidebar of history that we might sort of delve into at the end. But it all really got overtaken by, and I hate to use the term the management, but the reality that a terrible thing had happened in Parliament House, and there was, I guess, in a sense, a reckoning that occurred last week. So you wrote a beautiful column. Well, beautiful is probably not the right word. I found it quite moving yesterday about how the whole thing had come together politically. But maybe we'll start up today's discussion just with what we've learnt about, I guess, politics, and particularly our Prime Minister over the last week.
Well, it's been 2 weeks, really. If we sort of bring together the story you've set up, Pete, about big global developments, rollout of the vaccination campaign, response to the Aged Care Royal Commission that also got sort of squeaked yesterday, but these really horrendous stories of that sort of point to the Brittany Higgins story, which points to a number of very serious workplace culture issues in this building, and now more recently the historical sexual assault allegation levelled against a still unnamed member of the cabinet. So it's been just a very quick personal observation. It's obviously, like, 2020 was one of the sort of most intense reporting years of my professional life, because there was a very big crisis on, and that was a very big story requiring constant tending. I sort of thought maybe when we came back to work in 2021, things may be a little less intense, but certainly the opening of the parliamentary year for 2021 has been as intense as the sort of atmosphere that prevailed in 2020. In terms of, I think your question was sort of what have we learned about the Prime Minister really over the last couple of weeks? Was that the question, Pete? I fell off.
I just kind of think the question was discuss, but yeah.
No, well, I have this weird idea that you should answer questions when people ask you. Like, separates, it's weird, old-fashioned thing. But anyway, what have we learned? Well, it's been a really choppy couple of weeks for the government. We can get into the human dimensions of all of these stories, but and I have been in great depth, and I hope with great care over the last couple of weeks. But it's sort of certainly the Prime Minister has had the two worst weeks that he's had as the head of the government since the bushfires in last, where he basically couldn't manage a crisis in full public view last January, before, of course, he learned to manage a crisis with COVID. So we've sort of seen this reversion over the last couple of weeks. If we look at the culture stories, where the Prime Minister doesn't really want to answer questions, doesn't really want to attack this front on, didn't know, wasn't told, didn't ask. We've sort of seen that flavour, that sort of studied detachment, I guess would be a polite way of expressing it, which sort of harkens back, and this is the column I wrote overnight, it sort of harkens back to his famous "I don't hold a hose, mate" moment. We've seen that Prime Minister reappear over the last couple of weeks, particularly in relation to the culture stuff. But while the government's been dealing with the Brittany Higgins story and with this new one, as Pete says, big things have been happening. The vaccination rollout has started. We've had this fascinating three-dimensional chess play out between the government and Silicon Valley and the media companies negotiating deals with Google and Facebook over the last couple of weeks. It's kind of amazing that's all come together in a 2-week period when you think about it. And then, yes, a very important Aged Care Royal Commission story, which that shoe fell yesterday and was a bit subsumed by the unnamed cabinet minister and the rape allegations from 1988.
And I just want to say, like, I'm not quite sure what medium we're on. We're not a proper broadcast, but I want to be really careful and encourage people in the chat also to be careful. There's lots of chatter going around that. I think we will just keep it at the level that the responsible media has been dealing with that issue. And I do want to talk about the way the PM's managed it later, but let's just be really sensitive to both that and also the Brittany Higgins, which is still likely to be subject to legal proceedings. And but before we jump into the numbers, I just think there are constraints, aren't there, around how these debates are played out because of legal requirements, I guess also ethical requirements. Has it been, that particularly I thought the reports on Friday about the email coming out from the a deceased woman's friends that was then reported in the media. I think that's one I'm interested in, the ethics around that, and then obviously the Telegraph splashing with the counter email, the what about email from the Libs on Monday. Without going into the gritty of it, like, it's a minefield, isn't it?
Well, genuinely it is, because there's the interests in terms of the 1988 matter. There's the interests of the woman, the complainant, who very sadly is now deceased. There are recollections that of the allegations that she's made, that she's put together in a statement. She had some dealings with the authority before her death. She's also supported by a group of, I think the correct terminology would be high-powered friends, who are attempting to seek a measure of justice on behalf of their friend, who's, you cannot help but be profoundly moved by all of that. Then we also have to, because process is really the only thing that stands between us and chaos. We also need to be very careful to afford the person who has been accused of this sexual assault a degree of procedural justice and fairness also. And that is, it's complicated because it can't be just kicked into the domain of law enforcement, because the woman is now dead. I mean, it doesn't mean, I see a lot of commentary around the place that, well, obviously nothing can happen because she's dead. By that logic, no one would ever be tried for murder because dead people don't speak, and yet, people are tried for murder all the time. So it's sort of like, it's a bit silly, the whole conversation, but as a reporter, as a person charged with the responsibility of putting facts fairly and accurately before the public, there are different rights and responsibilities to weigh in terms of how these events are portrayed, whether people are named or not, whether information that allows them to be identified is put in the public domain. I have been very careful myself not to identify the woman by name, not to identify the circumstances in which her meeting with the man who is currently in cabinet occurred, because there are real people involved in these stories. This woman has friends, she has a family grieving, and these are unusual circumstances. But obviously both of these people, the complainant who is no longer with us and the person who has been alleged to have committed a crime, procedural fairness needs to be afforded to both of those people. They both have legitimate stories to tell. I think it's incumbent on the minister who has not been named to present himself to the public and give his account of what occurred. I think the woman's lawyer, who I spoke to yesterday, has made that point quite eloquently, why the current situation is untenable. I agree with that. I think it is. But obviously he's got to make that decision and about whether or not he will front or not. And the Prime Minister just wants it to all go away by saying, I've kicked this in the direction of the cops. The Prime Minister has options other than that, of course. The Prime Minister, in my view, could and should satisfy himself through his own process about whether or not that individual should still be serving in the cabinet. So see how it plays out over the coming days.
So a couple of interesting points that have been picked up in the chat. Thanks, Tony and Julia. So this is where public interest journalism is different to social media, and it may be all over social media, but that was kind of the points that were trying to be made around the value of public interest journalism through the news bargaining code. And it is interesting at a moment like this. Imagine without journalism, there would be a totally different dynamic being played out here. So just mark that. And we're going to go back and I think look at some of the attitudes towards Facebook and Google at the end of it. But where I want to sort of maybe go is it's really difficult. It's distressing. It's personal, but the role of the Prime Minister becomes even more important when things are difficult, distressing and personal. And I think when we look at our figures this week, I think I don't want to mistake correlation for causation, but there's something that's interesting that's gone on in the last couple of weeks, Catherine, and maybe that's a good point to jump into the next part. Is if we're seeing that okay, guys? Were we or are we? No, I've got to share my screen. Here we go. We have had the biggest drop-off in attitudes to the government's response since, you can go back to at least mid-year, but even more so. So the number has gone, the combined good, very good in the government response to the outbreak has gone from 69 to 62, which is a 7% drop, which is just something we haven't seen. It's been so steady and so locked in. It might be a blip. We might come back next week, John, and we're back up to a 69 again. But it's interesting, isn't it, that in a fortnight when the vaccine began to be rolled out, which is kind of the beginning of the next story of dealing with the outbreak, and there weren't any major cock-ups. There was a couple of stories of maybe the wrong vaccine dose, one instance, I think, but that's not what's dropped 7% off the approval. So these things aren't, that it feels, and there's some other figures I want to show in a sec. It feels like something's going on there, Catherine.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think it'll make more sense to people, Pete, if we go on to those other figures, I reckon, and show what's occurring on the attributes. It's also interesting too, and as Peter says, look, this is, you know, it's a result in a fortnight. Might be noisy for some reason, might not reflect reality. But it is interesting to me too that if we sort of line this result and the attributes result up with another poll, which has been in the field like us throughout the crisis, and that's some surveying that's been done by the ANU, that they basically have, along with us, been surveying the public throughout the crisis consistently. And we saw in the latest instalment of the ANU survey, which was sort of in the period over the Christmas break into January, a bit of a shift in consciousness starting to happen with voters about their attitude to the federal government and what the federal government was or wasn't doing in relation to the crisis. Now, that obviously reflects the fact that the supports, the fiscal supports that have been in place throughout the pandemic are starting to be rolled back. The job seeker is cut, JobKeeper is about to go. So people are aware of that. The Commonwealth has entered a very, for want of a better term, emotionally intelligent disposition to the public through this crisis in terms of that support. That support is about to be withdrawn. People know that. There's also this sort of interesting gap, which has been evident in our polling for a little while, between people's support for their premiers and the response and the support for Morrison. Sort of there is a gap. I mean, look, you'd like these approval ratings, whether it's 60 or whether it's 88 or whatever Mark McGowan is.
100.
100. Like, you'd be happy. Like, I'd be happy if 60% of my readers thought I wasn't an idiot. I'd say that was pretty a good day. But still, there is this air gap between Morrison and the premiers, and that gap seems to be increasing slightly, which is also interesting. But anyway, this will make more sense with the attributes.
Yeah, no, we'll just flip to the other ones that I thought were interesting this week. Was these are state governments, and John's given us little squiggly lines this time. Thank you, John. The big one there that makes sense is that the Vic government satisfaction, given that there was a week-long lockdown in the middle of it, was dropping down to 49%, which even at that level is still remarkable support, I think.
How durable Andrews has been, even in the worst of it. Yeah.
The others are all dropping off a tad, but nothing, you know, and gee, look at that WA government, which I think are off to the polls this weekend, isn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing.
And the opposition leader is calling for people to vote for him so he can make a strong opposition next time. So
sorry to laugh. What a funny contest that must be. I mean, obviously we're too far away from it to really fathom it properly, but it must be a very deeply strange contest that's playing on in the West at the moment.
Yeah. We're going vaccines before we're going attributes. So this is a bit all over the shop, but let's just go on the journey. There was no real change since a few weeks ago. I don't think, John, 10% of us are never going to get vaccinated, which is probably the concern for policymakers, because that's kind of the weakness in the public response, isn't it? 90% take up will get us 90% of the way there.
Yeah, it's interesting I mean, that sort of hesitancy or refusal is kind of like, if we look at that trajectory from August to March, is kind of more or less consistent. I just think, I've been like a broken record in these gatherings for several months. I just think that's something we need to keep an eye on, because obviously the effectiveness of the vaccine rollout is in part predicated on you know, as many of us as possible getting the vaccine, quite apart from the logistical issues. So given that we have this sort of overlay of vaccine hesitancy and anti-vax, that sort of dominates or makes a lot of noise. I just think it's important we keep an eye on that, how that plays out.
Hey, John, do we know anything more about that 10%? Is there any story that the numbers tell us about who that 10% is?
It's similar to what we've seen in previous weeks, in that, particularly voting-wise, it's people who are perhaps a bit less engaged with the political process, perhaps a bit more distrustful of major parties. So it's higher amongst those people who vote for a minor or independent party.
Yeah.
And then in terms of demographics, no, not too much change in them. The 10% is, that's about the big one.
10% run. All right. Sorry
Yeah.
for the spot there, but they don't vote for the major parties. Confidence in the rollout is still, well, it's actually slightly higher than it was a couple of weeks ago. So again, going back to that, there is nothing here to back in that drop in support for the government in these numbers.
Yeah, well, that's sort of the point, I guess, to make.
Yeah.
It's not because they, I mean, look, it was obviously terrible that those elderly people were given the wrong dose of the vaccine in Queensland. That was obviously a terrible thing to happen, and terrible thing to happen at the opening of the national rollout. But yeah, we don't seem to have a crisis of confidence here, do we?
Part of this.
Yeah.
All right. So we asked attributes of Morrison. I can't even remember why we chose this week. And I also would say we didn't line it up with Albanese. I think we were just interested in the halo that the Prime Minister has been wearing. So where we've asked the questions before, we've charted and on basically the negatives have gone up, the positives have gone down, and then we've put in 2 new propositions just because we're interested. One is control of their team and avoids responsibility, which obviously we haven't tested previously, but half the population seeing the Prime Minister as avoiding responsibility appears to me to be a potential Achilles heel for him. Really but there is a drop off there. And John and I were kicking this around last night. And what is interesting, and I don't know if my Guardian piece is up yet, which is probably a poor imitation of yours, but we do look at the gender split and all the drop-offs come from women. Like it's like being stable with males and all the drop-offs been amongst female voters. John, that's right, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So some of the big ones, for example, being a visionary. So last time we asked this, it was 48% of women thought that about Morrison. That's down to 37, so about a 12 percentage point drop. Similarly, good in a crisis has gone from 68 to 55, and trustworthy down from 55 to 48. So, and that's pretty consistent, whilst men are stayed about where they were. I think it's about 12 from last year, from May.
So again, we can't prove causation, we can only show correlation, but there seems to be, I don't know the right analogy, but there seems to be a ripple effect from what's been happening over the last couple of weeks that is particularly affecting women's views of the Prime Minister.
Yeah, and we're right to just assert those caveats again with the audience. Like we can't say with any certainty that this is directly connected to recent events because there are a few variables here. And sort of one of the kind of, before I, like there is a point I want to get to, but like I just make a more helicopter point. It's interesting too, it may reflect quite apart from recent events, which I'll return to in a tick, but the sort of drop-off could reflect in a way a sort of return to normalcy, that people think that we're sort of, we're coming out of the crisis and have sort of assumed they're more normal skepticism, perhaps. So I think that might be in the background too. But in terms of the general the gender split, not at all surprising. I mean, I've been struck over the last couple of weeks. I think it's, look, it's I'm just thinking slightly because it's fraught territory. I think I think it is certainly true that most women hear the Brittany Higgins story and the story that we've been prosecuting over the last few days since last Friday. I think women listen to those stories, hear those stories, take different interpretations of those stories than men do. I'm not saying that men aren't allies. Men, you know, there are so many great men who are allies, who understand these issues, who, I hate that expression lean in, but I'll invoke it here for want of a better one, who do lean in on this stuff and try and be good men, consider women as equals to themselves. Like, so, you know, I'm just saying, for all the men on this call, love your work. But I do think that women hear these stories slightly differently to men. The thing is too, I've been sort of thinking about this a lot, really over the last couple of days. I think what makes these stories really resonate with women, apart from everybody has their own experience of these things in their lives, is that, and where I think it's genuinely dangerous for the Prime Minister, his sort of passive response over the last fortnight, is that every woman, regardless of age, socioeconomic status, generation, life experience, profession, every woman in the country has had an experience of being not listened to by a man over things ranging from very small and insignificant to very important things, where women have felt in their life that men have not listened to them, not validated them. I think every woman in the country brings that experience into these stories. And so if the Prime Minister looks passive, defensive, not really interested, sort of talks about managing the thing rather than the thing itself, I think a lot of women would hear a man not listening. And that's, I think that's where it's genuinely dangerous for the Prime Minister in a gender sense, because that, I think people hear that equally, whether they are, you know, woke, again, a dreadful word, or not woke. I think every woman in the country has had that experience. Everybody carries that experience. A number of women in the country also carry direct and personal experience of sexual harassment, assault, or worse. So it's, anyway, I'm not surprised. It's a long-winded way of me saying surprised.
What I find really fascinating about that analysis, Catherine, is that, you know, the principle of political communication is around framing, and framing is to understand where your audience is and work within their frame of reference, right? So it's one of the reasons why it's really hard to move the conversation on New Start and income support, because there's this deep-seated story that if you are too generous to people, then they will take advantage of your generosity. Like it's kind of, for some reason, ingrained in the consciousness. But what I'm hearing here is that the challenge for the Prime Minister is not, in a way, it looks like he's entering the ring, sparring away every day to stay above it. But in terms of framing the political issue, he hasn't done that hard work and recognized that he is speaking. It's not that it's not about coming up with a double track message. It's recognizing that those that are going to be listening most closely have the story that you're articulating there.
Well, it's just genuinely interesting to me because this Prime Minister thinks carefully and closely down to the minutiae of how he will communicate on any topic.
And you saw it yesterday with the aged care. I thought he actually did a pretty good job of framing that up around his lived experience.
Guy never comes with a freewheeling presentation on anything.
Yeah.
Guy always turns up with a set of propositions and a set of messages that are informed by where he thinks the public is at on any given issue. He doesn't, Malcolm Turnbull was sort of fond of, sort of lengthy extrapolations and dispositions.
Dissertations.
It's sort of like everyone's got their different methodologies, right? I just, like, in my observation of Morrison, this guy doesn't open his mouth unless he's thought about how to frame an issue. It's why, I get very frustrated with him and some of his colleagues because of the shutdown of questions, that they avoid answering questions so often. And part of the reason the Prime Minister seeks to avoid answering off-the-cuff questions so often is that he hasn't necessarily thought through the best formulation for the answer. So I'm just genuinely intrigued by this. Does the Prime Minister somehow think that presenting to the voters as sort of passive on this stuff, on the gender and the culture stuff, that's a winning formula? Like maybe he knows more than I do. In fact, it's certain that he knows more than I do. He has access to very high quality research and data about what voters are thinking on any given issue. This guy has good research. So maybe I'm wrong and he's right, but I have just been struck by watching him communicate now for 2 weeks solidly on this issue of culture and present to women as if he's not listening. And that is, again, like I've used a lot of words I hate in this session, but that's genuinely triggering for a lot of women. If someone actively not listening, it's a bad way to present yourself. Just saying.
And look, thanks for those that are sharing their own experiences of being in a workplace. What we might do is keep going through the slides. If we've got time, just offer an opportunity for a few of you to share some of those insights towards the end. I just don't want to rush through them. We've got a few more questions on this, and I think to your point, that first slide, 65% think the government's been more interested in protecting itself than the interests of those who have been assaulted, speaks to that. And I'm not, John, was there any like while Catherine's talking, just I'm interested if there is any partisan leaning on that one or not. But what do you make of it? Feels like a repudiation of the last couple of weeks, Catherine.
Yeah, and it's I think the government has certainly conveyed that impression of being more focused on managing the issue from a like crisis management standpoint than opening itself up genuinely to the underlying fundamentals. But we shouldn't be surprised about that. I mean, the sort of worst of the Brittany Higgins story is really understanding how easily that those circumstances could have occurred.
I got the sense that his primary objective early on was to ensure he didn't lose his defence minister.
Well, it's sort of like, how can I explain this for people so it makes sense? It's sort of like if something, the whole of professional politics is geared around a set of incentives. So if there's ministers, principals, politicians who run their offices, there's only ever one set of interests or problems in an office, and that's the problems of the minister. There's really no room, no time, no bandwidth for anybody else to have problems. So the whole operation runs around managing the interests of the principal in a way that other workplaces don't function that way. Like it should be, it's unsurprising in that sense that when a crisis presents itself, that the crisis is managed through the prism of the minister's interests and the Prime Minister's interests, which is about, not, as you said, Pete, not losing his defence minister or not losing control of the narrative or whatever. That's how politics works. That's at the root of the problem in terms of the cultural issue that there is in the building. It's because everything revolves around the interests of the principal. So that's why when a hierarchy of needs gets asserted, the needs of the minister are far more important than anyone else's needs. And that's not malice. That's not everybody just sitting around working out how to be dreadful human beings. That's just how politics works. That is how the whole thing is wired and geared for. So rather than sort of, I think like Morrison at no point has sort of stepped out of that matrix and tried to imagine how this looks.
When he spoke to Jan.
Well, but even that.
Well, how did you make of that? It was, I think it was one of his attempts to come up with a narrative to show empathy, but I think it was more a reveal that it would take a proxy of your wife to actually have that empathy. Yeah.
It's certainly how the comments were interpreted was that it was sort of like, oh God, like, you know, and I wrote something.
Yeah. I don't think it was bad intention. I just think it was tin-eared though.
No, exactly. It's kind of like what you've got to, why can't you move your own plumb line rather than have to rely on an empathy consultant, i.e. your wife in this instance, to say, hey, actually move your plumb line. You know, and again, that's a sort of, it's kind of like, again, it's a bit of a trigger point for women. It's like, oh my God, what, you know, why have we got to be responsible for shifting the dial on this stuff all the time? Why do we only have these epiphanies when we manage men to better conclusions? Like all women really want is for men to reach better conclusions themselves. So I think, as you say, I think he meant well. I think he meant to convey the fact that he, like other people around the country, had sort of discussed this issue around his own kitchen table, that his perceptions of it had been shifted through that real world conversation. I think he meant it, he intended it as a story about growth, i.e. his own, but it came across in a way that sort of conveyed that he would need somebody external other than the Prime Minister to tell him how to, you know, have some emotional intelligence.
And just tell me, do you give credence to the theory that it's not the same on both sides because Labor's had 20 years of pushing towards a quota? Because that whataboutism has come through in two forms now. One was reheating the Emma Hassad mess, and very poorly managed mess at that. And the other was this sort of what about email, which again, people know what's going on out the side of their mouth. So is it kind of a pox on both houses, or is one house actually the poxy one?
Well, it's sort of interesting though, because in the way these questions have been framed, you know, like particularly the second one, if we look at the graphs on the screen, right, politics has a particular problem with harassment and assault. I think like Morrison's been keen for two reasons to sort of say this is a jointly owned problem by everybody in politics. One, to try and warn Labor off against too aggressive pursuit on these issues. Two, to create a sense in the public mind that this is an institutional problem across all political parties. Because if everybody's responsible,
then no one's responsible.
Well, and your own culpability,
is diminished.
Right. But in terms of the substantive question you asked, well, look, no, you know, does harassment and bad conduct only exist in the Liberal Party? Well, no, it doesn't only exist in the Liberal Party. There have been instances in the Labor Party as well, and in the Greens as well. Documented incidents. So it is a problem that exists.
I'll give One Nation its due as well, Catherine.
Oh my God, yes. Oh God, I'd forgotten. I'd sort of bleached my brain and forgotten that. But One Nation as well, right? So yeah, look, there is a problem across politics as an institution. However, I would say that a couple of things though. I think there is I do think certainly in the Labor Party, there is a culture of feminism that does not exist in the Liberal and National parties. I think it's the cultures are demonstrably different. And that is in part, I think, due to the higher level of female representation in the parliament on the Labor side than the government side. I mean, women in the Liberal and National parties are like literally have concussed themselves from banging their head up against the wall, trying to get a sort of more default equal culture in their own organisation. I think the cultures are quite different and measurably different. But that's not to say that bad stuff doesn't happen on the progressive side.
Of course, there was also Nicole Flint walking away and that being very much perceived as being about the attacks outside politics from progressive groups on her, where does that fit into the mix?
Oh, well, look, she's sort of, I wouldn't necessarily frame it in those terms. She's like a lot of women in public life, she's had more than her fair share of gratuitous commentary about how she looks, how she sounds, what clothes she wears, had this sort of rolling gratuitous commentary. And obviously hard fought campaigns in her seat. It's the most marginal seat in South Australia from memory. So they're going to be hard fought contests and sometimes personal contests in those seats. Look, I haven't spoken to her just because I've been preoccupied on these other issues. So I can't say with authority, but I do know, just talking about that culture, those cultural differences between the Labor Party and the Liberal Party. I mean, one of the hardest things about reporting these stories over the last couple of weeks has been the extent of grief in the building about them. I can't describe how profound that is from across all parties, but it sort of manifests slightly.
Yeah, they're working in a crime scene at the moment.
Well, it's just, people are just, I don't know what the word is. I haven't got the word for you. But they are just beside themselves with all this, regardless of which political movement they belong to. Everybody feels a sense of ownership of these stories. There's a universality, which sort of brings back to the point, the meta point, right? There's a universality about these stories. There are trigger points for women associated with these stories, right? So it's sort of like there's definitely that. But I know, look, I mean, it's just like the irony of Linda Reynolds being the minister who, is alleged to have not provided sufficient duty of care. I mean, Linda has actually found a voice over a long period of time about, cultural problems in her own political movement. And I think women in the government are quite worn down by that, quite worn down by that sense of having to fight for oxygen all the time. So anyway, it's been a very profound couple of weeks.
Well, you'll be pleased to know that you've now got less trust in the political officers in the entertainment industry. So Harvey Weinstein, step back. So is this the MP2 moment? I don't know. But it feels like it is a moment, doesn't it? So for those that haven't been following it closely, there is a commitment to deal with the void, at the very least, isn't there, in terms of staffers? Maybe. Maybe not.
Look, I think we're sort of moving in a direction of a more independent process, which may yield some concrete recommendations that may improve things in offices. Myself, though, I think the toughest nut to crack in all of this is that strange employment relationship that I was trying to talk about before. That sort of gearing around the interests of the principal culture in political offices is reflected in their employment instruments. The fact is, like, political staff have do not have workplace rights that we would recognise in other workplaces. They are hired and fired at will. They have no job security. They work basically at the behest of the boss, serving the interests of the boss. It's a very unique workplace in that sense. There's no independent human resources function for political staffers to go and report issues to. They have to run the gauntlet of reporting in their own organisations, which is hard work, right? So, look, I genuinely hope that politicians and through the pressure of their staff and the frustration of their staff will recognise that this is a moment where different processes do need to apply in this building. Different workplace arrangements need to apply here. Staff need to be given some power and some agency. But that's quite a difficult, that's a very big cultural shift. And whether or not the parliamentarians, who are the ones who currently now have almost absolute discretion over their staff, have the wit and the will to give them their staff some power, I think that's a really, I don't know whether they will or They won't. I don't have confidence that they will. I mean, it's what should happen, but I don't have confidence that it will happen.
Last couple of slides on this. Actually, my favorite is on, these are long-term questions we've asked a number of times. So on one level, there is, 76% saying there has been significant progress on gender equality. There is still a long way to go. But of the same sample, and this is probably the last slide, I want to sort of reflect on these two, which I think that first one, the gender equality has already been mostly achieved, says 50% of the population probably is a headline in itself. Now, it's not totally, John, I don't know if you want to give the actual gender split there, but it really, I think, speaks to, a lot of the issues we've been dealing with today.
Yeah, for that first statement, which is 50% overall, we've got 62% of men agreeing with that and 39% of women. So almost 50% more men. And that's consistent with the second statement as well. 56% of men agreeing, 34% of women. Significant differences. And also at the other side of the scale as well, women are more likely to disagree with these statements.
So yeah, that's the situation analysis there, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Those different perceptions sort of goes back to how women and men, as at the sort of level of gross generalisation, will be listening to these stories differently. They will be refracting these stories through different prisms. They will have different starting points for listening to this material, and that brings us full circle, really, with what this is kind of telling us.
So we might come up for air. We've only got 10 minutes left. I don't know if there's anyone that Zorene's been organising to come up and sort of contribute. I saw that Jolene was sort of speaking for a lot of people around the workplace there for a moment. But let's, while we're seeing if anyone does want to sort of put up their hand, Catherine, let's throw forward. You're sitting down with the Prime Minister today and saying, mate, you need to shift this in all our interests. What are you going to say to him?
Well, I would probably, if I were afforded the luxury of having a private conversation with Scott Morrison today, I would say what I've said here. I would say, I'm not sure that you understand sufficiently the different starting points, assuming where people are consuming this information. Look, at one level, it's not only sort of one thing I haven't said, Pete, and I should, because I've sort of presented all, the PM's been obsessed with political management, which is true. The PM is obsessed with political management, but it's sort of, there are some difficulties, particularly in the latter case, the 1988 case, about what process you might be able to put in place in order to afford that procedural fairness that I was talking about at the beginning. It's not only God, how do we just like assume the crash helmet and get through this? It's kind of like, well, if we were to do a process that was beyond just saying the cops will take care of it, what might that process look like? How would that process afford procedural fairness to a now deceased woman and a person who is prominent in the public eye? I shouldn't suggest to people that these are uncomplicated issues. They are quite complicated issues. So we're giving him that respect, giving the Prime Minister that respect, that it's difficult, it's complex, there are different issues he needs to balance, material interests he needs to balance. I think the thing that has been lacking is that intrinsic sense that people are hearing what he's saying differently. People are bringing their own life experiences and their own trigger points to this conversation. So I would just say that to him. Have you thought about that?
There's a bit of comment in the chat that there's a plan for a women's march on Parliament on March 15. Are we aware of this, Catherine? Have you got any?
I'm unaware of that. I'm unaware.
I have been seeing it bubbling around on the social media channels. So that could sort of keep the ball ticking along as well. So here we are. We've got a couple of weeks off Parliament. We've got a Royal Commission to land. We haven't really spoken about the cuts to job seeker, which are quite sharp. I suspect there's going to be economic consequences there, and JobKeeper as well. So
the thing, I mean, we sort of started at the beginning by flagging that like really big things are happening too, in and amongst these quite sort of stories. There's, you know, there's what's happened with the platform. There's the cut to job seeker, which will have economic implications. We'll have to see how great those economic implications are, as well as obviously fairness and other implications. And then the Aged Care Royal Commission, which I feel horrendously guilty that I haven't even had a chance to read yet, and that dropped yesterday. That I gather that involves contemplating potentially a whole new funding model. So,
well, the fundamental problem appears to be that the commissioners couldn't decide on the answers themselves. So that's going to be this massive opportunity to kick the ball down the road.
Yeah, I can't really understand that. I've seen the reporting of it. I need to read it to be able to better understand that point myself.
And then amongst all of it, and I won't bother you with the slides, but people want to regulate big tech. I'm pleased to see. My passion project is to regulate big tech, and we've had some strange bedfellows over the last few months, including some of the people on the government side. And I must say that when you have a common purpose, they're very good people to work with. And I just think that's the other thing to remember with all this. I suspect that there are people on the other side of the house that are looking to find a way through some of these challenges. Not all the good people play for the one team. And I found it quite interesting. Has been running the media bargaining code to learn that, but just in terms on regulating big tech, it's 75% plus. And so hopefully the legislation, which is going to facilitate deals, which will substantially improve the position of the Guardian in terms of providing public interest journalism, as with other outlets, will just be the first step in that process. And at least there, it does seem the government does want to push on it. I'm not quite sure what's going on there apart from Murdoch, but I think there is something more there as well. So,
like, genuinely quickly, there's like the democracies have reached a point with the platforms where custodians of institutions like parliamentarians are aware that the platforms represent a genuine threat to democracy. I think people realise that now, like at all levels. Right. So obviously, presumably the government has done this in order to buy itself not buy itself, but accrue some favours with mainstream media outlets. I don't know. I presume that's the motivation. I genuinely haven't followed it.
Haven't been seeing you doling out many, Catherine.
Well, I was going to say good luck. Anyway, but I do think, as a person who talks to parliamentarians for a living, like all the time, I think a number of them across the parties have sort of reached a point of consciousness that parliamentarians around Western democracies have started to form over the last couple of years, which is now, the bargaining incentives are all out of whack. We've got these mega platforms that can be harnessed for propaganda, misinformation, disinformation. It's fine if the wind's at your back, but it's pretty bad if the wind's at your face if you're a parliamentarian. And I think people are genuinely, because they care about democracy, even though they don't always show it, they are quite preoccupied by these issues and want to.
And my high point of the last few weeks was seeing all these Liberal MPs getting up, talking on the need to regulate a monopoly. So we should record that and sort of put it in the vault for future use. I feel like I should give you the final word, just in terms of this session. But thanks for being part of it, Catherine. And I don't know if you've been seeing the chat on your phone, but it's been a really great discussion from people sharing their own personal experiences today as well.
Well, I haven't seen that, sadly. And it's always good if you guys speak up and let us know. I get the sort of little chat messages, but they're so fast. And I'm concentrating on what I'm saying too, because obviously there's some pretty high impact things we've been dealing with in this session today. Anyway, yes, just obviously, I guess I would just say the duty of care message to everybody on the culture stories. Take care of your loved ones, take care of yourself. If you find the content distressing, don't pony up further, step back from it. I know from my own conversations that a lot of women have really been dealing with all forms of grief themselves because of their own experiences, both in and outside politics, and men too, the men who support women through these traumatic experiences. So, I mean, by all means, consume it all and understand I'm at my post and conducting my affairs vigorously, but also step back from it if it's a bit much.
And also kudos to your colleagues in the gallery, some fine female journalists, not just yourself, but, you know, Louise Milligan, you know, Tegan George, a young reporter at Channel 10 holding the PM to account. There's a lot of, Sam Maiden just letting go. So there is a level of accountability I can see that's coming out of Canberra that actually says everything that's great about having a diverse and committed press gallery. So I think from everyone, thank you for your work over the last couple of weeks as well, Catherine.
I appreciate that.
We might wrap up on that point. We'll see you again in a couple of weeks. There's all sorts of things going on and you'll get invites to all those, but thanks for being part of it today, everyone. Cheers.
See ya.